Welcome to the broadcast, Your Voice, Your Future. I'm your moderator, Armstrong Williams. Let's be clear as we examine all the protests around the country and as it continues to escalate and not de-escalate, is that ICE is not the threat to our communities. The real danger is the growing tolerance for lawlessness, masquerading as protest movements that have become increasingly hostile, disruptive, and violent. What we're witnessing is not organic dissent, but a calculated effort to fracture this country from within. This is not invasion by military force. It is subversion by chaos. Law enforcement officers do kill innocent people in the line of duty. Yet every tragic era is instantly weaponized by those waiting in the shadows, groups and agitators who profit politically and culturally from outrage. They do not seek justice. They do not care about the death of the young woman who died in Minnesota. You know, they seek ignition. Their goal is to delegitimize authority, exhaust public trust, and push institutions toward collapse, often with the amplification of media ecosystems like legacy media, social media, that reward conflict over context. We saw this strategy unfold on Ivy League campuses, where disorder was allowed to fester until it finally had to be shut down. Much of the coverage did not cool tensions, it validated them, flattening complexity into grievance and framing enforcement as provocation. Now, those same forces have found new oxygen, exploiting the deployment of ICE agents under President Trump as their latest rallying cry. And let me just be clear, I don't always agree with President Trump's rhetoric. He should tone it down. He should acknowledge that a young woman died tragically. He should encourage law enforcement, as the majority of them already does, is to only pull that trigger if you feel that you're absolutely threatened. There's even in watching the kill shot, I felt that the officer, particularly surrounded by other officers, had other choices, but they too are human. And in that split second, he did something that was irreversible. He took her life. But these rallying cries following this are turbocharged by legacy media and social media algorithms that prize outrage and virality over truth. Let me tell you this is no longer about immigration, civil rights, or reform. It is about power, about who benefits when cities burn, when laws are paralyzed, and when Americans are turned against one another, while legacy media outlets and digital platforms too often serve as accelerants rather than brakes. You know, history is truly unforgiving to societies that confuse chaos for conscience. And the longer we indulge this deception, the closer we move to consequences we will not be able to control. Let me welcome our guest tonight, Steve Laffey, former presidential candidate, and Goodman, America's Money Answer Man. Steve, your thoughts on what we face today? Let me be clear when I talk about law enforcement. I don't know if people realize this, but to me, everything is about facts and integrity. Believe it or not, close to 1,100 to 1,300 Americans die every year at the hands of law enforcement. It's combined all the Western democracies in the world together. Boy, it does. It's a lot of people. But still, defiance over complying is a problem. You have the court system. If you feel you're being wrongly aggrieved, then take it to the court system. It is not worth losing your life over protesting. And you're not surrendering, you're surviving to survive another day. It's not worth your life. Even if you believe law enforcement is wrong, it's best to comply and not get into a situation of defiance. Steve?
Yes, exactly. And as a former mayor also in charge of, 100 and some odd police officers, you see things that you really don't want to see. But yes, I think what happened, specifically about the tragedy in Minnesota, it's always better teach my children, comply, we'll deal with it later. In this case, what we are seeing, and this is a wider scope than just the tragedy, is someone who doesn't, and a tragedy happens, and you hit it right, because police officers, whether they're ICE, local policemen, FBI agents, they are under tremendous pressure on a daily basis. And it would be far better if the president didn't weigh in on it. Nobody weighed in on it the way Obama weighed in on what happened in Florida back, over 10 years ago. They shouldn't weigh in on it. Let the Justice Department and let the justice move forward so we can find out what happened. But you are correct. There are far too many people in many of these cities who are walking around with cameras, who are trying to incite other people now to riot, and they're not going to stop because their ultimate goal is to bring down America. And we've got to do a better job of educating our young people about how important that America really is, especially with our anniversary coming up this summer.
Jordan Goodman, I was absolutely flabbergasted when learning that Trump, even though he tells us that he had no idea that the Department of Justice was indicting Fed Chair Jerome Powell. It's really shocking considering the fact that he only has a couple of months left. But now, what the president has forced him to do is to dig in and probably stay longer. That video was pretty direct. He did not mince words.
Right, but just to be clear, he's going before a grand jury. He has not been indicted yet. But Powell came out and said, I've been referred to the grand jury for potential indictment over basically saying things, perjury to Congress in talking about the renovation of the Federal Reserve building, which is about a $2.5 billion project. I think Powell's a man of incredible integrity. I don't think he perjured himself. And this is being perceived as a way for Donald Trump to get leverage over the Fed, to take away some of their independence and to get them to lower interest rates faster than they would otherwise. And I think you're right. It's going to have the exact opposite impact. He's digging in his heels, and he's not going to bow to pressure at all. They have a meeting coming up at the end of January. I don't think they're going to lower interest rates. This is part of it, but in general, I don't think they're going to lower interest rates either.
Steve, he lashed out at Senator Susan Collins from Maine, Josh Hawley, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, because they decided to vote with Democrats. And he says they should be ousted, they should be condemned. I mean, is this a pattern that should make people uneasy?
Very uneasy. The president is sort of spinning out of control in the last couple of weeks. Listen, we know what he wants. He wants affordability, which the Republicans have lost on in the last election. He wants to turn that around. But what he's doing is, one, just take the tariffs, how he wants to spend the money. That will cause more price increases. He's already spent it 4 different ways. He wants to send out $2,000 checks to people. It would be $600 billion for everybody making $100,000 or less. We're only taking in $250 billion a year. He thinks he can stop income taxes with it. And then you take the flip side of getting affordability. He wants oil at $50, and he calls in oil executives who try to politely explain that to go into Venezuela, we need to be 70 to 80 with a rule of law. It's not happening. And then he says they can't go in, like the chairman of Exxon, who doesn't want to go in anyway. Then you take all the other things they're trying to do to keep, like the 10-year bond down. They're buying bonds again. Scott Bessent is praying that stable coins buy all the U.S. treasuries. He's issuing less longer-term bonds. All of this is sort of failing. Think about it. September of 2024, 10-year bond yield 3.64. We started cutting interest rates in the short term. Today, they're 4.18. They're higher. So then they come up with other ideas like the 50-year mortgage. Think about it. the 50-year mortgage will never go. One of the reasons is if you take out a 50-year mortgage and you pay it off, and instead of a 30-year mortgage, after 30 years and a $400,000 mortgage you took out, you would have paid it off. In a 50-year mortgage, you would still owe $306,000. So every idea they come up with is someone flailing around. How about the ones where we're only going to let credit cards charge 10% interest on credit cards? Well, credit card companies will stop issuing credit cards. That will hurt poor people the most. It will continue like this until they start dealing with reality. But I think they're very scared over the elections coming up in November.
You know, let's look at the big picture, Jordan. How would you describe the current state of our economy right now? Are we stabilizing? Are cracks still
it's weakening.
widening?
I think it's weakening in every area except artificial intelligence infrastructure. There it's booming, okay? We're adding about $400 billion in investment per year. That's the only area of the economy that's just booming right now. I would disagree with President Trump, who said it's an A++ economy. I don't think people feel that at all, and you see that in the polls. We just had an unemployment report on Friday. 50,000 new jobs created, a lot less than expected. The unemployment rate went down a little bit, but the employment market is very, very weak. College graduates are having a really, really hard time finding jobs these days. Consumers are being very cautious spending because they see the price of things going up and their earnings are not going up to keep up with it. Consumer confidence is pretty low. The two things that are going up is artificial intelligence spending and the stock market, which hit another record high today, despite what happened with Chairman Powell. And the other thing that's going up, gold and silver, dramatically going up. Today, gold went over $4,600 an ounce for the first time ever, and silver's up to about $85 an ounce. A year ago, it was $30 an ounce. So that's what's going up right now.
You know, what concerns you, Steve, because the Federal Reserve Chair, he's facing this controversy and criticism, and people think it's pretty serious. It is important to have trust in the Fed's leadership for financial markets and global confidence, particularly when it relates to the U.S. economy and the world is watching. Are interest rates doing more harm than good at this stage, particularly for housing, small businesses, and credit markets, Steve?
Well, they're doing more harm, but there's not much that anybody can do about it because we live in a free market world. The Fed could lower short-term interest rates to zero. They would then watch the 10-year note, no matter how many, they should trade at 9%. And then they'd have a destroyed economy. So I don't know why they want these things. If they want a successful economy for many years to come, they've got to go about and start solving real problems. Instead, between Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, and the President, they seem to be flailing around. And it's like the dike is starting to break on all this debt. Remember, in 2020, we paid $340 billion in interest costs when we take in about $5.4 trillion. Our income tax has taken 2.4. This year, we're over $1 trillion in interest costs. So you can issue it all short term. It's just that at some point, people say, we don't want it. We don't want any of it. And that's the real worry that Scott Bessent, the President of the United States, and people in the know have. Going after the Federal Reserve Chairman about a building. I mean, you could have fired him over the fact that for 5 years he didn't get inflation down to his stated goal of 2%. That would have been an issue a year ago. Now, Chairman Powell will probably stay on at the Fed because he has 2 more years. He has personally over $100 million to fight any legal course, and he's going to fight. This can't be good for Donald Trump. If he's listening, stop it. Like stop the nonsense. You don't want oil at $50 because Harry Ham, who does all the fracking, can't do any more oil. You want oil at $60 to $80 and stable. You want a world that looks to America as the hope for freedom. You want NATO to be secure so that you want all these things, Armstrong. And unfortunately, the president is just making too many pronouncements that make no sense right now.
Jordan, your final comment?
Armstrong, something happened over the weekend that people do not know about, I want to tell people about, which is that the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, turned on the alternative BRICS system to the SWIFT system. They are trying to get away from the US dollar and do transactions in the BRICS currency. It started in Brazil, it's going to go to the other places. These countries are trying to de-dollarize the global economy. We've had the dollar as the central bank reserve currency for the world since World War II. That is being eroded, and they just turned the switch on this weekend, and that's not getting a lot of attention. That's one of the reasons why gold and silver went up so much.
Jordan Goodman, Steve Laffey, thank you so much for joining us for Your Voice, Your Future, and we'll be back. Mary Holland is a children's health advocate and policy analyst, and our physician in residence, Dr. Bryan Donohue, MD, Cardiology, joins us. Welcome to the broadcast. You know, Dr. Holland, explain to us what is infant mortality and
Sure.
how it's defined.
Sure. I'm not a physician. I'm an attorney by trade, and I run Children's Health Defense. Infant mortality means death of infants before age 1, and it's used throughout the world as an important indicator of children's health or children's lack of health. And the United States is not at the top of the pack according to this indicator at all.
You know, Dr. Donohue, I'm sure you want to add to it, you're being the physician here tonight, but what causes it?
So Armstrong, thanks again for involving me in these important conversations. Infant mortality is not a simple, straightforward thing. It's a complex series of events that contribute to, just as Mrs. Holland said, to death within 1 year. In general, it's divided up into 2 groups. So children who die within the first 27 days of life are thought of succumbing to neonatal mortality. Beyond that, it's called postnatal from day 28 to 100. And the causes vary. There are 5 large causes, though, from the medical perspective. The first and probably the most important is congenital malformations. The second has to do with preterm complications. So that really means from the unborn person's perspective, complications within the fetus. That accounts probably for just about 1/3 of all infant mortality. The third, which is a very interesting thing because it demonstrates great regional variability, is the sudden infant death syndrome. The fourth are maternal complications. That means things that happen from mom's perspective. And the fifth cause of death within the first year are generally grouped as so-called unintentional injuries. So that would be falls, auto accidents, that kind of thing. So probably the single leading cause have to do with preterm complications, followed by SIDS, or the sudden infant death syndrome.
You know, Ms. Holland, I don't usually get into racial and ethnic disparities, and we do focus on socioeconomic indicators, but why do rates of infant mortality remain so high for certain groups?
Yeah, they are not consistent across states, Armstrong, and they're not consistent across racial and ethnic groups. So groups that tend to have less economic resources and groups that are in states that tend to have poorer health care have worse outcomes. And there's some pretty marked disparities. So for example, in the United States, the state with the worst infant mortality is Mississippi. And the best is Vermont. And in sort of among Black mothers is the highest rate of infant mortality of all, over 10 deaths per 1,000, which is a very high rate. The kind of average rate among Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development Countries, basically developed countries, the average rate of infant mortality is about 4.7. So to have a rate of almost 9 in Mississippi is double the average for about 38 countries. So it's a really important. It's tragic to lose any baby, obviously, at the very beginning of their life, but it is an indicator of some significant issues that need to be addressed.
When Aaron suggested that we talk about this, I started doing some research, and I was really shocked of when I was reading what you can do to reduce the risk, Dr. Donohue, and it stated create a safe sleeping environment, the baby's mattresses, their sleep patterns, how something like that can make such a significant difference in reducing the deaths.
You're exactly right, Armstrong. And some of the solutions, the data-based solutions that have been shown to work are very straightforward.
Yeah.
And as Mary suggested, with that having been said, it's just a tragic omission to not press on the gas pedal a little bit harder on that. So, for example, most of the adjudicating groups that oversee physicians' patterns of care recommend that obstetricians see mother at least 4 times during the pregnancy. And that would let us understand a great deal about how the unborn child is doing as well as how mom is doing. And we saw earlier how those 2 variables are so important in terms of baby's outcome. You're quite right that the occurrence of sleep-related deaths is much higher than you would intuit. And it is not entirely clear why that's the case. So there's been a great deal of thought in this area of sudden infant death syndrome. You're right that the sleeping conditions matter greatly. There's been some debate as to whether there are actual infectious origins to this kind of apnea that occurs. There's some inferential reasons to think that's the case. For example, there are clusters of these sudden infant death syndrome experiences. It was thought that they may relate to exposure to Clostridium, but in any case, that's not a settled matter. But it probably amounts to somewhere between 10 and 20%, Armstrong, of the aggregate occurrence of infant mortality.
Ms. Holland, what about, the newborn screening? Is there more that the parents should do?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. Certainly one of the things that, we at Children's Health Defense are very concerned with sudden infant death. Now it's often called sudden unexplained infant death. And there is quite a bit of evidence. We have been critical of this narrative that it's, how the baby sleeps, whether on the baby's back or on the baby's stomach. What we have found, and we're doing current scientific research on this now, Armstrong, is that babies' deaths are often correlated with hypervaccination, and that they die within a certain short period of time after getting 5 or 6 vaccines at once. For instance, we chronicled a little girl last year in March 2025 who received 6 shots, but about 18 different antigens at one time. And she, perfectly healthy baby, but they said, oh, we need to give you the catch-up schedule. And she died 12 hours later. We're dealing with a case of twins right now, 18-month-olds who were given a big number of vaccines. The parent had said, the fathers had adverse reactions to the flu vaccine. The administrators, the healthcare practitioners said, oh, it doesn't matter, it's not a problem. And a girl and a boy, fraternal twins, died on the same day. We do think that the changes that are being made right now by Secretary Kennedy and Health and Human Services to pull back on this vaccine schedule that has not been adequately and rigorously studied, despite what others have said about it, is very, very important. Because what we do see, based on science, is that there are spikes right after the 2-month vaccination period, right after the 12-month vaccination period. And these need to be looked at much more critically.
You know, I'm just flabbergasted at what Ms. Holland just clearly stated about the over-vaccination of these babies, Dr. Donohue, because sometimes you wrestle with how much or how little that child should be vaccinated. But what do you say from the medical perspective, why sometimes these vaccines, when they're just go beyond any kind of measure of rationale, that these innocent kids end up dying?
Well, the thought on it is, the traditional thought is that sudden infant death syndrome is a complex interaction of a number of factors. It's been described
Well,
as
I want you to address the vaccines, because I think what she said is really earth-shattering, particularly to parents and particularly mothers watching the show tonight on the vaccines. I don't want you I don't want you to skirt around it. I just want you to answer that directly.
No skirting around
Please
it.
Don't.
But given the sort of understanding that's baked into the current medical literature, the role of vaccines is not well established, although it, heaven knows, is a matter of active debate. And it's so often the case that when we don't know the answer, we sort of.
But we do know what Ms. Holland just said, that many of these kids, if they're over-vaccinated, they die. You can address that as a physician.
Yes, and so we know now, particularly after the COVID experience, that there are downstream consequences of vaccinations, and they primarily have to do with an exuberant immune response. So, for example, you'll recall the occurrence in young men between 17 and 20, particularly, of myocarditis, inflammation of the heart. You don't see that in young men absent the vaccine. So you could postulate that there is a kind of provocative effect that these vaccinations provide, particularly when they're bundled, as is currently the delivery mechanism in America. But if you asked, is that an established understanding, the answer would be no.
Well, the established understanding is that these babies are dying. What other understanding do you need?
Well, you need to know the cause.
Well, the baby was doing fine until they over-vaccinated. That's the cause. That's common sense.
It may be common sense, but it is something that is not well understood. It's thought in
Mrs. Holland, wait a minute. What were you about to say, Ms. Holland?
No, I agree with the doctor that it is not well established that there is a connection between over-vaccination and SIDS. But one of the things, honestly, I just learned is that in the military, where there's a lot of vaccination that happens for people in the military because of the threat of infectious disease and being in places with very different kinds of public health issues, they never give more than 5 vaccines at once. That is a rule within the military.
And those are adults. Those are adults.
Exactly. And those are adults that are chosen for their physical resilience.
Yes.
And yet for infants in the United States, there is no maximal number of vaccines that they can be given. And typically the doctors and the American Academy of Pediatrics will tell the front line, oh, they're safe and effective, they save lives. And so there's no appropriate sense of caution around this medical intervention. And it's very clear from literature that has been written and in peer-reviewed journals over the last 15 years, there is a correlation between vaccination and sudden infant death. And I'm happy that I believe that the HHS is now really being willing to look into this. For instance, the hepatitis B vaccine was given on the day of birth. If you look at what justified that, it was frankly pretty ridiculous. In the clinical trials, they studied it for 5 days. They didn't have a control group. They used children up to age 10. And yet literally 4 million babies in this country had a standard of care to receive a hepatitis B vaccine on the day of birth. Hepatitis B is sexually transmitted or through IV drug use. This was pretty remarkable. It's now been pushed back to at least after 2 months. And the American Academy of Pediatrics was very upset about this. I think, many of sort of people in the traditional community have been upset about this, but I see this as a real triumph because why would we be giving a day-old baby about whom we know virtually nothing of their health
Well, I'll
status
tell you what, when we come back, we're going to ask the doctor, and I'm curious to find out just how Dr. Donohue feels about the Kennedy HHS pushing back on these vaccines. We'll be back.
It is easier to build up strong children than to try and repair broken men.
The streets are plagued with crime, violence. There's a lot of poverty, and it's all a result of lack of education that's happening in our schools. So it really is a crisis.
We come from very different political perspectives, but we've come to the same conclusion, and that is there is a crisis in the classroom. Children are being deprived of quality of life because they're being deprived of a good education. We must solve this problem. It's incumbent upon all of us to join hands together to get this done.
We can't afford to wait one more day before we address these issues, because every day we lose another child.
Let's stop the politicking. Let's stop the games. Let's really do something to give these kids a real chance at life and being a part of that American dream.
We need accountability for funding. Many of the districts where you're seeing very low test scores, students graduating with very low literacy and math comprehension rates, they are receiving a lot of funding. So where is the money going where our kids aren't being adequately educated?
If you believe every child is deserving of a quality education, please go to educationjusticefoundation.com. Dr. Donohue, you have the floor, brother.
Thank you, sir. So, Mrs. Holland raises a very important point, and that is that we're looking carefully now and in a data-based way at how effective or how meddlesome these vaccines are. I think it's a very important point, probably worth fleshing out just a little bit, that delivering these things in batches is something that we should really be careful about in particular. But let's go back to what we were talking about a moment ago, the hepatitis B vaccine. So
before we get to the hepatitis B vaccine, I need you to tell us how you feel about the HHS secretary rollback on these vaccines.
So it's a mixed bag. I don't support, for example, the issue of measles vaccines. I think that is really a kind of it's something that the crowd loves. But if you actually look at the consequences of the campaign so far to not endorse in a full-bodied way the measles vaccine, I think it's a very mixed picture. So we're all familiar with what's happening now in South Carolina with this current outbreak. We're also familiar with what has happened recently in Texas and prior to that on the island of Samoa. And all of those outbreaks relate to changes in the public perception of the measles vaccine. So vaccines are not a monolith. Some vaccines are clearly established and of great value. Others, on the other hand, have been habitually delivered, but really are worth looking at again. So I think it's a mistake and a little bit glib to just put all vaccines, as if we were saying all medicine or all fever, into a single domain.
But I only want you to put it in the context of these babies.
So amongst the babies, it's hard for me to rationalize giving a newborn baby a hepatitis B vaccine to the extent that she is not at risk for hepatitis through any of the traditional passageways. People, on the other hand, who think long and hard about this, make the point that it is a critical safety net to avoid perinatal transmission. I don't really see that as a compelling argument. I think it makes great sense to at least leave it up to the individual parents. And we all know the source of risk for hepatitis B is a very measurable thing. So if you're very low risk for hepatitis B, therefore your child, your infant, is at very low risk. I'm not in favor of mandating these things any more than I was in favor, you'll recall, of mandating the COVID vaccine.
Ms. Holland, how do you respond?
Well, I appreciate what Dr. Donohue is saying. And in fact, that is what HHS has just done, is to make hepatitis B now be shared clinical decision making. So this should
Right.
be like a doctor talking with the parents and saying, you know, your baby's really not at risk for hepatitis B. You might want to skip this one. Right now, in certain states like New York, the hepatitis B shot and several doses of it are required to go to school, to go to daycare, to get, you know, to do anything. There are no religious exemptions in New York, and medical exemptions have been very difficult to obtain. So, you know, that's an issue. Also, I would take some issue with what Dr. Donohue said, that in West Texas, that reflects recent changes in perceptions of vaccines. We actually sent a media team to West Texas in the outbreak there in the Mennonite community. And this is really a matter for many people of religious conviction in Amish communities, in more traditional religious
Agreed.
Orthodox Jewish communities. This isn't a new fad. They just really don't believe in vaccination. And, you know, the free exercise of religion is in the First Amendment in this country for a reason. And so we certainly stand behind the notion that people must have the right to make these decisions. Of course, they need full information. Of course, they should be free to get vaccines if they want them, but they also should be free to exercise their conscience. And if it violates their conscience, whether it's a COVID shot or a measles shot, we believe that that person should have the right to follow their conscience.
What about the vaccination of these babies for the different influenza shots, Dr. Donohue?
Well, I agree with exactly with what Mrs. Holland just said. These are always should be matters of individual choice. And so there is I can't imagine that a persuasive argument can be curated where we decide that everybody going to daycare has to have this list of vaccines. I think that's the kind of tyranny we're looking to avoid, and influenza falls into that group. So again, I think people in general are very competent to make their own choices and to incur the consequences of those choices. And I think that the less bullying there is on the part of the government, the better we all are. So that would include the influenza vaccine, but also any, you know, the measles vaccine. Although I personally, for example, I have 6 children and they all got a measles vaccine. I personally received the COVID vaccine. But just as Mary says, this really ultimately is a matter of a personal conviction. The government has a role in informing us, but it doesn't have a role, in my judgment, in obliging us.
You know, I'm just really curious, Ms. Holland, when you think about who actually is making the decisions and who benefit most, because we know who benefits least are the kids and the parents. But does it goes to show the huge influence of big pharma, their oversized impact on hospitals these days, and the insurance companies as well. And is it less about medicine and the care for the child these days and more about profits?
Well, we put a lot of attention on that, Armstrong. We really do think that big pharma has really corrupted medicine to a great extent. And I think COVID laid that bare for the global population in a way that had not happened before. And so I agree with Dr. Donohue. There's a lot more skepticism towards vaccines post-COVID than there was before. But particularly in COVID, I think we absolutely saw profits above care of people. We saw a kind of tyranny. If you're not vaccinated, we won't treat you. If you're not vaccinated, we will mistreat you. We did a film called Vax 3 that really shows absolutely nightmarish stories of what happened to people in hospitals. So I think that there's a lot to be done in this area. Chronic disease is very profitable. And I do believe that hypervaccination early in life sets children up for chronic disease. And we've seen an explosion of chronic disease among children contemporaneous with this explosion in the vaccine schedule. And the vaccine schedule exploded once the Congress passed a law that gave them a liability shield. They didn't have to worry about actually facing lawsuits for injury and harm or death from vaccines. A government compensation program was set up in 1986. I think these things have been huge. And what I believe is the case is that vaccines are not treated in the same way as other medicines. You can sue Big Pharma. It's not easy. It's very hard. But Big Pharma has a real interest in making sure that medicines are tested for 5 years. They have a real control group. They put real warnings on them. None of that is true in the vaccine space, and that's very problematic.
Dr. Donohue?
Couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. You know, as physicians, we are endlessly accountable, and that's a good thing. We should be. But there is a sense in which these vaccines have been somewhat more reflexive, just being administered really per weight of habit and tradition. And one of the things that's, I think, happening now in the wake of COVID in particular is we're looking at these strategies as independent risk variables. So really, what is the up and the downside, for example, of any given vaccine? That's kind of a new process. And part of it is it's been very hard to measure, for example, immune response. And you'll recall all this discussion we had earlier, Armstrong, about cellular immunity versus antibody immunity. We're just not good at assessing some of the more sublime effects of these vaccines. And there are many. There are many. I take care of a great number of young athletes, professional athletes, and they all were obliged to get the COVID vaccine early on in the course of things to continue their athletic performance. And it was like we created a bit of a petri dish for vaccine complications in those dark days of 21 and early in 22. And none of that was really as evident in the past as it was in that time frame. So myocarditis being one of them. Other complications that relate to what the old doctors called serum sickness, meaning an exuberant immune response causing antibody production, which is not perfectly crafted. So kidney issues and heart issues and immune issues. So it's absolutely the case that we should take the scale firm in hand and assess the effectiveness of these vaccines the way we do any other procedure that I might do as a heart cath or a stent or any medicine that the doctor might prescribe. And it is interesting that this has all kind of flown a little bit under the radar for an awfully long time. Time now to flesh it out.
You know, Ms. Holland, I'm so happy that you're a children's health advocate. You can only imagine the planning that goes into pregnancies and the pregnancies that just happen. You go through this gestation for 9 months and all of a sudden your child dies. All of a sudden. I mean, it's so overwhelming, it's so traumatic, and we need to do everything we can to make sure that these parents have healthy babies. Is there anything else in your closing comments that we should be concerned about?
Well, I'm so delighted for this conversation. You know, there aren't many great conversations about this issue, Armstrong. So truly, I'm very grateful. We have a terrific website with a tremendous amount of information. And I think what we all want really are to have healthy children and to have a healthier next generation. And I think we can agree that there's more that we can do to ensure that children are healthy and that they grow up to be strong, productive, prosperous people.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to meet you and to have you on. Dr. Donohue, it's
Likewise.
Always a pleasure to have you. And we definitely need to challenge physicians like yourself because you hold, unfortunately, sometimes life and death in your hands. And that's
Yes,
an
sir.
awesome responsibility. And the Hippocratic Oath of Medicine is first, do no harm. Thank you both for joining us, and we'll be back.
As a home buyer, you need a lender who cares about your home ownership dreams. United Security Financial has been helping families secure their dream homes for 30 years. We're a national fair practice lender that provides affordable mortgages and low down payment programs to eligible home buyers. To learn how United Security Financial can help you secure your dream home, call 1-800-373-4186.
And of course, you know, every Monday night on Your Voice, Your Future, you know what happens in this final segment. We always go to a MAHA report and a MAHA contributor. And tonight, Amy Sapola, Pharm.D, functional medicine practitioner, joins us. Welcome to the broadcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Our pleasure. What are the major changes in the 2025 through 30 dietary guidelines, and why was the pyramid flipped, and what does it prioritize now?
Yeah, so the big change is there is a new focus on whole, real food. And I think that's the take-home message. The pyramid was flipped to really reflect this change in metabolic health. So less of an emphasis on whole grains or grains in processed food, more of an emphasis on vegetables and protein being the center of the plate. So moving away from processed foods and added sugars being part of the American diet, more to real whole foods.
You know, I was just thinking, as I was listening to you, how so much is driven by profits, how we actually allowed the industry to convince us that Fruit Loops and cinnamon flakes and Kellogg's Frosted Flakes, and we bought into that. And do you realize what we were eating and what we were putting inside our bodies? Because they told us it tasted good?
Yes, and that's the new dietary guidelines say there is no amount of recommended added sugar that should be in any of our food. It really should just be whole food with natural sources of sugar. And that is a really big change. And as a mother, I'm excited because that's really going to change school food policy as well.
How will this affect, let's say, the school lunch and federal nutrition programs?
Yeah, so it's a phased-in approach, but essentially as soon as they release these guidelines, they're effective. And schools are going to phase this in over this school year and the next two, so that you'll likely see less added sugar in school food, also more protein, less carbohydrates. I think this is really going to have an effect on attention span in kids, especially when we look at the school breakfast programs, where often there are those sugary cereals or breakfast, muffins or cakes or whatever. Changing that to real whole food is going to affect how our children learn and can pay attention through the day.
But how do you take it from the school and also make parents realize what they're feeding their children at home matters? Because if you get it right in school and you don't get it right at home, you're still somewhat defeating the purpose. And I know for some parents it's about affordability. We know what food deserts are, but how do we get more parents to buy into it at home?
Yeah, and this document was really a fundamental shift. The last dietary guidelines were 164 pages. This is 10. And the message is eat real food. I mean, that's really it. Vegetables, protein, whole grains, get rid of the processed food, get rid of the added sugar. And so I think that's much easier for parents to implement than the complicated previous dietary guidelines that were quite confusing and really allowed for more processed food. So this is really looking at the foundations, going back to a really common sense approach. If it grows in the ground, comes without a label, it's likely great to include.
What is your background? How did you get to this place?
Yeah, so I have a Bachelor of Science in Nutrition. I'm also a Doctor of Pharmacy, and I've trained in culinary medicine, culinary coaching, functional medicine, integrative medicine, and lifestyle medicine. So I really love looking at nutrition as the foundation, and then as a pharmacist, looking at how do we keep patients off of chronic medications. And something that was exciting to me about these guidelines is they really focused on food as foundational and not looking at the medicine cabinet as where we kind of access health.
What's the evidence, Amy, behind emphasizing protein and full-fat dairy, and why are processed foods and added sugars not a bigger concern?
Yeah. So first with protein, the original guidelines really focused on like this 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. And that was based on basically not having deficiency. And deficiency in no way equals optimal health. And so the new dietary guidelines really update that to look at what do we need for optimal health. And so they updated it to be 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram per day in dietary protein. That makes sense as long as your BMI is less than about 30. If you have a higher BMI, that could mean kind of unrealistic amounts of protein. And so sometimes that's using an adjusted body weight or an ideal body weight, working with the practitioner to figure out what's right for you. And also if you have certain medical conditions, it may not be right. But for the majority of Americans, eating more protein means better metabolic health, better muscle health, better muscle maintenance, so less decline in strength as we age, and also just feeling fuller, more satisfied. So, and then with fat, they changed a little bit. It's interesting because there's been such an emphasis and so much controversy around the fat piece, but they have stayed the same. They recommend no more than 10% saturated fat in the diet. That did not change. However, they stopped basically making it out that butter or beef was poison, right? And so we know real whole foods act differently in the body than processed foods. So having a teaspoon of butter with your vegetables is not the end of the world. That's okay. Using those traditional fats and getting away from some of the seed oils. We know that there's benefit to that. And also with those fat soluble nutrients that you'll find in like your broccoli, if you have some fat with those, it helps you absorb those vitamins and phytonutrients better. So there's definitely benefits to having some of those healthy, naturally occurring fats. They say getting it from olive oil, which is consistent with the Mediterranean diet. And we know there's a lot of research to support the Mediterranean dietary patterns. And then again, with things like butter or beef tallow, which are consistent with kind of more traditional cooking.
Let me interject this before we go in about a minute left. How do you, which is also critical to this, help teenagers and adults also manage their alcohol consumption?
Yeah, so in these dietary guidelines, they really recommend no regular alcohol, right? It is very important to have social connection. And we know that people are going to drink socially, but it doesn't necessarily have to be daily. So instead of the prior guidelines recommending like one drink, no more than one drink a day for women or 2 drinks a day for men, this really just says limit your alcohol consumption. And I think that's important to consider, but also to consider the importance of social connection.
Amy, how can they learn more about you and more information on this topic?
Yeah, so I write for the MAHA report. I'd love you to read our articles there. And then those are on Substack. And then you can also find me at amysapola.com.
Amy Sapola, thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank all our guests for joining us. Ms. Holland, Dr. Donohue, Steve Laffey, Jordan Goodman. Excellent dialogue tonight. We look forward to having you back in the future. I'm Armstrong Williams. This is Your Voice, Your Future.